She walked into the most expensive restaurant in the city alone, and 31 people watched her do it. Not because she was poorly dressed, not because she stumbled, because her ex-husband had just announced from the center table, in a voice calibrated to carry, that the reservation had always been in his name. 7 words. That table was never yours, Su Yan. 7 words, spoken with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent 4 years mistaking her patience for weakness and her silence for defeat. The table was gone. The room knew it. And somewhere in the kitchen of Cheongdam's most whispered about private dining establishment, a man who had not spoken above a necessary volume in 11 years set down his tea, straightened a cuff, and began to move. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? She was standing. That is the important detail. Yoon Soo-yeon did not flee. She did not fold her coat over her arm and move toward the exit in the small, apologetic way her ex-husband was anticipating. She stood precisely where the maitre d' had paused, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair that did not belong to her, and she looked at Kang Dae-hyun with an expression that 11 people in that room would later describe, independently, as the quietest form of fury they had ever witnessed. Not anger. Fury. There is a difference. Anger moves outward, fury holds. Kang Dae-hyun was 43 years old, and he had been in the habit of underestimating Yoon Soo-yeon since the 2nd month of their marriage, when she had quietly reorganized the accounting architecture of his family's construction holding company and saved it 340 million won in unnecessary tax exposure, and he had nodded and said, "Very good," and moved on without asking how. He had been moving on without asking how for 4 years. The divorce had been finalized 11 months ago. He had kept the penthouse, the car, the membership at the club, where he was now entertaining clients from Busan. He had assumed the social geography of the city remained his to assign. He had not accounted for Cha Sung-jin. Almost no one ever did. Cha Sung-jin was 51 years old, and he occupied the far corner booth of Sin-sien, the private dining room within the restaurant that the public room did not know existed, the one that required neither a reservation nor a name, only a particular knock sequence and the word of someone already inside. He was not a large man in the way that men who need to be feared are often described as large. He was measured. He was still. His suits were made in a small atelier in Jeongsidanjil by a tailor who had been dressing him for 19 years and who had never once been asked to cut anything louder than charcoal or deep navy. He had interests in 6 logistics companies, 2 private port authorities, a biopharmaceutical research fund, and a network of relationships stretching from the port of Incheon to 3 cities in Japan that no organizational chart would ever confirm. He was the kind of man of whom it was said only in passing, and never twice to the same person, that the city functioned because he allowed it to. He had known Yoon Soo-yeon for 8 years. Not closely, not yet, but long enough to know exactly what she was. He had first encountered her at a private bond restructuring session that her then employer had sent her to represent, a session that 18 finance directors and 2 senior partners from a white shoe sole firm had expected to dominate. She had been 39 years old. She had spoken 4 times across 6 hours. Each time she spoke, the room recalibrated, not because she raised her voice or claimed the floor with performance, because she was always 3 moves ahead and she never announced it. She simply waited until the moment when what she knew became undeniable, and then she named it plainly, and then she was quiet again. He had asked about her afterward to the person who had brought him. The person had said, "She is their best analyst." He had said, "No. I mean, who is she?" The person had not understood the question. That was the distance between most people and Cha Sung-jin. He was asking about the thing beneath the credential. He had watched her career from the comfortable distance of someone who keeps careful records of people worth watching. When the marriage to Kang Dae-yoon occurred, 3 years after that session, he had noted it the way one notes a structural flaw appearing in an otherwise sound building. Not inevitable, but a risk. When the divorce came, 11 months ago, he had noted that too. When she was passed over, 6 months after the divorce for the managing directorship, she had built 3 consecutive record years to earn by a committee that included 2 men Dae-hyun played golf with. He had set down his pen and sat very still for a moment, which was the closest Cha Sung-jin came to visible anger. He had not intervened. It was not his place. Soo-yeon had not asked anyone for help, and he understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent decades observing how competence moves through the world, that intervening without invitation was its own form of disrespect. But tonight was different. Tonight, a man with a smirk and a borrowed center table had spoken 7 words in a voice meant to carry, and a woman who had spent the last 11 months quietly rebuilding everything she had given away in 4 years of marriage was standing alone in a room of 31 witnesses with nowhere to sit. Ka Sung-jin did not raise his hand. He did not speak from his corner. He simply rose with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has never needed to signal authority, because authority is the room's problem to read, walked through the archway between Sinseon and the public dining room, crossed 12 meters of burnished oak flooring, and reached the empty table to Soo-yeon's left, which was the best table in the public room, the one with the low amber lighting and the unobstructed view of the Han River, the one the maitre d' kept tactically unavailable for the first 2 hours of every evening service because the right person sitting there was worth more than a reservation filled. He pulled out the chair. He did not look at Kang Dae-hyun. He did not need to. "Miss Yoon," he said, "I believe this one has always had a better view." The room was very quiet for 3 seconds. Then it was the kind of room it had been before Dae-hyun spoke, which is to say it returned to itself. Which is to say, the 31 witnesses turned back to their meals with the practiced discretion of people who understood that something had just occurred that would be discussed in other rooms for weeks, and that they had been present for it. And that was enough. Soo-yeon looked at him. She did not perform gratitude. She did not flutter or deflect or cover the moment with the kind of social noise that would have made it smaller. She looked at him with the full, direct attention that was her most distinguishing quality, the quality that had made 18 finance directors recalibrate 8 years ago, and she said, "Thank you," 2 words, waited precisely. She sat down. He sat across from her. Kang Dae-hyun watched this from the center table. His clients from Busan watched him watch it. He lifted his wine glass and set it down again without drinking. He understood with the slow, cold comprehension of a man whose social architecture depends on being the dominant variable in any room, that something had shifted, and that it had shifted in a direction he did not have the tools to reverse tonight. He did not know who Cha Sung-jin was. 3 of his clients from Busan did. One of them had gone very still. None of them said anything. That silence was its own information. Soo-yeon opened a menu. She had not been allowed to open at the other table. She was not thinking about Dae-hyun. She had spent 11 months not thinking about Dae-hyun in the way that requires enormous daily discipline and produces over time a kind of internal architecture that is stronger than the one that preceded the marriage. She was thinking about the man sitting across from her, who she had met formally twice and informally once, who had just done something that cost him nothing in material terms and everything in terms of the signal it sent, and who was now regarding her with the particular quality of attention that she recognized because it was the quality she herself possessed and almost never encountered in return. He was not looking at her performance. He was looking at her. She said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know. He'll construct a story about it." "He already has," Sung-jin said. "The story will be wrong." A pause. The amber light held steady over the table. Below them, through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the Han moved with its indifferent, ancient patience. "What will the correct story be?" she asked. He considered this. He took his time, because he always took his time, because rushing an answer was how most people avoided giving a real one. That a man who never understood what he had chose a public room to demonstrate it, he said, and that the demonstration failed. She looked at him for a moment. You watched that session, she said. The bond restructuring. 8 years ago. It was not a question. I did, he said. You asked about me afterward. He paused. Yoon In Cheol told you he mentioned it. Once, years later, she set the menu down. He said, you asked not about my credentials. You asked who I was? Yes. What was the answer you were looking for? He said, I wanted to know whether the quality I observed was trained or native. A beat. Most competence at that level is trained. Trained competence is valuable. It performs correctly under expected pressure. But it doesn't hold under conditions it hasn't seen before. He looked at her steadily. What I observed in you that day was something else. You were 3 moves ahead of a room full of trained professionals in a situation you could not have fully anticipated, and you were calm, not composed. Calm. Those are different things. Composed is controlled. Calm is the absence of the need for control. She was quiet for a moment. I was terrified, she said. I know. That's what made it remarkable. Dinner arrived. The meal moved in the way that meals between 2 people of serious attention move, which is to say the food was excellent and unremarked upon, because neither of them was there for the food. They talked about 3 things. They talked about the Biopharmaceutical Research Fund, because she had read the public filings and had 3 observations about the capital stack that he had not yet heard from his own team. They talked about the managing directorship she had been passed over for, not with bitterness, but with the clinical precision of 2 analysts examining a flawed decision model. And they talked briefly and only once about the marriage. Or rather, she described one thing about it, one specific quality of the 4 years that she had come to identify as the central mechanism of its failure. He never asked how, she said. Sung Jin nodded. Not once, not about anything significant. I would solve something, and he would note that it had been solved and move forward. She looked out at the river. For 2 years I thought this was simply his manner. Confident men don't explain themselves and assume others operate the same way. A pause. Then I understood it was specific. He didn't ask how, because asking how would have required acknowledging that the answer lived in me and not in him. And that acknowledgement had a cost he wasn't prepared to pay. Sung Jin said nothing for a moment. Then, how long did it take you to understand that? Longer than it should have, she said. 18 months in, I began to understand it in the margins of other things. When I would watch him speak to colleagues about work, I had done without attribution, not out of malice, I don't think, but out of a genuine flattening, as though the work had simply appeared. She turned back from the river. That is a particular kind of erasure, the kind that doesn't know it's erasure. It's the most dangerous kind, he said. Yes, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and set a business card on the table. Not his own. A name, she recognized. A headhunter who operated exclusively at the level of board appointments and division head mandates for the 7 largest conglomerates in the country. A person whose call you did not receive unless someone who mattered had placed your name in front of them. They will reach out on Tuesday, he said. The conversation will be entirely yours. I have offered only your name, nothing more. What happens after that is a function of what you want. She looked at the card. She did not pick it up immediately. Why? She said. Because the work you did at Hanjin Credit 3 months ago should have been in every financial journal in the country, and it wasn't, because 2 people whose opinions depend on Kang Dae-hyun's goodwill made sure it wasn't. He paused. I don't correct every injustice, I don't have the standing to, and it isn't my purpose, but I can return a name to the rooms it belongs in. She picked up the card. She said, I don't want a position I was given. You won't be given anything, he said. You'll be seen. Whether they recognize what they're seeing is their problem to solve. A silence settled, warm and undemanding, the kind that only exists between people who do not need to fill space. She said, "Table for one is actually fine. Most of the time, I've gotten used to it." He said, "I know. That's not why I sat down. Why did you—" He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment the amber light did something to the air between them that the room's 31 witnesses had long since stopped watching for, because 7 words in a voice calibrated to carry is a particular kind of cowardice, he said, and cowardice in a public room deserves a public answer. He looked at her directly. "And because you were standing and the table was available, and I have been watching the wrong distance for 8 years. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them looked away. Days later, the call from the headhunter came on a Tuesday, as stated, at 9:14 in the morning. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. The position being discussed was not managing director. It was Group Chief Strategy Officer for a holding company whose annual consolidated revenue was approximately 4.2 trillion won. It was a position that had not existed 6 months ago because no one inside the company had possessed the architecture of thinking it required. Soo-yeon sat in the kitchen of the apartment she had taken in Mapo after the divorce, a small, clean space with southern light that she had chosen because it was entirely hers, and she listened and she asked 8 questions, and at the end she said she would give her answer within 72 hours. She set down the phone. She sat with the silence for 20 minutes. She thought about 4 years of work that had moved through the world wearing someone else's name. She thought about the 3 managing directors who had been appointed above her, one after the other, none of whom could have reconstructed the models she had built for them if given a week, and all her notes. She thought about what Sungjin had said about calm versus composed. She thought about how she had sat at that table in Qingdam with the amber light on the water and felt, for the first time, and longer than she could accurately measure, that she was in the presence of someone who was asking how. She picked up the phone. She called the headhunter back in 41 minutes, not 72 hours. She said yes. Weeks later, the formal announcement moved through the financial press on a Thursday morning. Her name, her photograph, the title. It was written in the factual language of corporate appointments, and it said almost nothing about what she actually was or what she had actually done to arrive at this moment which she had expected, because those announcements never do. They describe positions rather than people. They note credentials rather than the quality beneath them. But 3 people called her that morning who had never called her before. And Kang Dae-yoon saw the announcement from the center table of a different restaurant in Gangnam, where he was breakfasting with a client, and he set his phone face down on the table with a precision that his client noticed and did not remark upon. And for a moment he was very still, and in that stillness he was perhaps for the first time asking how. The answer would not come, not from her. She was not his to ask any more. Those weeks after her appointment, Sha Sung-jin read the announcement in a single motion and folded the newspaper along its original crease. He was in a car moving through Yongsan, heading toward the Port Authority meeting that would occupy his morning. He looked out at the gray Han. He thought about what she had said. That table, for one, is fine, most of the time. He thought about the 8 years of correct distance. He thought about the moment he had crossed 12 meters of oak flooring and pulled out a chair without asking himself whether he should, which was unusual for him, because Sungjin was a man who asked himself whether he should about everything. He had not asked that night. He had simply moved. He was still examining that fact, what it meant, what it said about the state of him. A man of 51, who had spent decades operating in a world that rewarded the withholding of impulse and the management of all signal. He had wanted her to have the table. He had wanted to be the person who gave it to her. He was honest enough with himself to know that the money had nothing to do with correction of injustice. Though injustice was real, it had to do with her, with the quality of her presence, with the way she had stood alone in a room of 31 witnesses without collapsing into smaller postures, with the 8 years of watching from the wrong distance. He put the newspaper in the seat pocket. He thought about Tuesday's call. He thought about 72 hours and 41 minutes. He smiled briefly in the window's reflection. She had not waited for the permission of the deadline. She never had. Months later, the trial of Park Sung-ho, the former chief investment officer of the holding company Soo-yeon, had joined, who had been quietly siphoning, restructuring funds across 14 subsidiary accounts for 3 years before her appointment, concluded in 17 days. The evidence was meticulous. It was the kind of evidence that takes not weeks, but months to compile, which meant the compilation had begun before anyone except the compiler understood what was being compiled. The junior analyst who had assembled it had been placed in the role by Soo-yeon in her second week before anyone knew there was anything to find, because Soo-yeon had read the subsidiary reports and noticed a particular category of accounting rhythm that was not wrong in any single instance but was statistically improbable across the pattern, and she had quietly opened a drawer. She had not announced it to the board. She had not gone to the chairman first. She had protected 2 mid-level managers whose signatures appeared on the fund transfers because she had established through careful review that their signatures had been forged, a fact Park had been relying on to distribute culpability downward if he was ever caught. She had caught him. She had protected the people beneath him first, then she had gone to the chairman. The chairman had listened for 31 minutes without interrupting. Then he had said, "Miss Yoon, how long have you known this?" She had said, 6 weeks. I waited until the evidence protected the 2 managers conclusively before bringing it forward. He had been quiet for a moment. Then, "Why didn't you come to me earlier?" She had looked at him steadily. Because incomplete evidence in a room with power attached to it creates pressure that can move in the wrong direction. I needed the picture to be finished. He had nodded. Slowly. Then, "What do you need from me now?" She had said, "Your signature on a referral to the Financial Intelligence Unit and the support of your legal team for the next 30 days. He had given it. Sung-jin heard about the Park investigation 3 weeks before the announcement through a channel he was not supposed to have, which is to say through the ordinary functioning of a network built across 30 years. He heard about the forged signatures and the protected managers and the 6 weeks of silent documentation before any power was notified. He sat with this for a long time. He thought about the bond restructuring session 8 years earlier. A room of trained professionals and one person who was 3 moves ahead and showed none of it until the moment showing it could not be avoided. 6 weeks of protection before power. That was her architecture. That was the thing beneath the credential. He called her that evening. She answered on the second ring. He said, "The Park matter." She said yes. "You waited 6 weeks." "Yes." "Because of the managers." "Yes." A pause. He said, "I need you to know that I am aware of what that cost you in terms of personal exposure during those 6 weeks. If the information had leaked before you were ready, the trajectory of the story would have changed." "I know," she said. "You accepted that risk. The managers had families," she said. It was a plain declarative. It required nothing around it. He was quiet. "Sung-jin," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the formal address, and the shift was small and enormous simultaneously. "I have been thinking about something you said. About the difference between trained and native, about calm being the absence of the need for control. Yes, I think there is a version of that which can become its own kind of withholding. A calm so total that it begins to look like distance, like watching from the correct distance indefinitely." A long silence. "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking about the same thing. I am not interested in distance," she said. "I want to be clear about that," he said. "I know." A pause. "I have been clear about it to myself for some time. I have been less clear about how to move from knowledge to action without performing it. You pulled out a chair, she said. You didn't perform it, you just moved. Another silence. This one warmer than the one before it. Dinner, he said. Not the restaurant, somewhere smaller. Yes, she said. Saturday. Yes. She set the phone down. The southern light in her Mapo kitchen had shifted to the amber of evening, and she sat in it for a moment, not doing anything, simply existing inside the fact of the day, the trial concluded, the managers reinstated, her name in the financial press for the right reasons, and a Saturday ahead that had not existed that morning. She had not planned this, not any of it. She had planned only the next correct thing each time, and the next correct thing, in aggregate, had produced a life she was beginning to recognize as fully her own. The restaurant, the 7 words, the amber light, the chair that had always had a better view. She thought about that, about the image in it, about the way Sung Jin had said it without looking at the man who had meant to humiliate her, had simply redirected the room toward something true, the way she had done in the bond session with 18 finance directors, the way she did with 6 weeks of silent evidence, the way quiet competence always eventually does, not by defeating noise, but by outlasting it. 7 words had opened the wound. 6 words had turned the room. She found herself quietly counting, not out of bitterness, out of the recognition that language compressed and aimed correctly was the tool of people who knew exactly what they were doing. He had known, she had known, that was new. That was the thing she had not had inside the marriage and had spent 11 months building the internal architecture to recognize when it appeared. The recognition of being known, not managed, not arranged, known. In the way that means someone has been paying close attention and has decided, on the evidence of that attention, that what they are looking at is worth continuing to look at, worth asking how. The Han moved outside her window 5 kilometers west of where it had moved, beneath that restaurant, indifferent and ancient and uninterested in the human accounting of what had shifted above its banks. But something had shifted. She knew it with the same quality of knowing that had identified Park's accounting rhythm, from the subsidiary reports before she had language for what she was seeing. Not a feeling, a recognition. She closed her laptop. She stood in her kitchen in the southern light turned amber. She was, in the most fundamental sense, entirely herself. That was enough to begin with. Months later, still, the story that spread through the financial networks of the city, told in fragments and from several angles, none of them complete, acquired the shape of something the city tells itself when it needs to remember that its map of power is not the same as its map of worth. It was told as the story of an investigation. It was told as the story of a trial. It was told by the people who had been in the restaurant that night as the story of a chair. The version about the chair was the one people returned to because it required no legal language and no financial explanation. It was simply a man who rose and walked 12 meters and did a small, deliberate thing that cost him nothing and meant everything, and a woman who did not perform gratitude but simply sat down and opened the menu and began. Kang Dae-yoon left his position at the construction holding company 14 months after the dinner, for reasons described in the press as a mutual strategic transition. He was 44 years old. He moved through the city in the way of men whose social architecture has been quietly reorganized around their absence, not with drama, but with the slow compounding recognition that the rooms no longer reset to him when he entered. He was never asked how. He had never learned how to ask. Park Sung-ho received a sentence of 4 years and 8 months at the conclusion of his trial. The 2 mid-level managers whose signatures he had forged were formally cleared, publicly, in the same judgment. One of them sent Suyin a handwritten note that arrived on a Tuesday, 11 lines long, that she read once, folded carefully, and kept in the second drawer of her desk. The headhunter who had made the Tuesday call received, from an anonymous source 3 months after the appointment, a detailed brief on a candidate she had not yet encountered, with a note attached that said only, "This is someone worth placing your full attention on." She did. The candidate was offered the directorship he was suited for and had been invisible without the right set of eyes finding him. That was how it worked, not transactions. Attention. Attention given forward, generatively, without arithmetic of return. Suyin understood this better than she could have articulated it at the beginning. The Saturday dinner was at a restaurant that did not appear in any guide and required knowing someone who knew the owner. A small room above a canal in Sangdong-gu, with 6 tables and a handwritten menu that changed without announcement. They arrived separately and were at the table before either of them had said anything of consequence, and for 20 minutes they ate and talked about nothing important, which is to say they talked about a novel she had been reading and a shipment delay he was navigating and the particular quality of light on canals in winter. And it was unremarkable in the way that only things which are deeply right are unremarkable. Then she said, "I want to tell you something." He put down his fork. "I am not interested in being managed," she said. "Not well and not kindly. I have been managed by someone who thought management was the same as care, and I know the texture of it, and I am not going back there." "No," he said, "I need to be known. I need the person across the table to want to understand how the thinking works, not just to benefit from the result of it." "Yes," he said, "and I need," she said, looking at him directly, "to be able to tell you when you are wrong without it rearranging the room." He nodded. "I am wrong with reasonable frequency," he said. "I have become accustomed to people not saying so." "I know. It has not improved my accuracy." "No," she said, "it never does." A pause, he said. "I want to understand how the thinking works. I want that specifically, and not as a means to anything else. I want to ask how." A pause. "I have wanted that since a bond restructuring session 8 years ago in a room of 18 trained professionals, when a 39-year-old analyst spoke 4 times across 6 hours and moved the room each time, and did it from a position of calibrated calm that I recognized as rare and have been watching from the wrong distance since." She looked at him for a long moment. 8 years is a long time to watch, she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you done watching?" He said. I pulled out a chair. She smiled. It was small and not performed for anyone in the room, including him. It was the smile of a person who has received an answer that is accurate. "You did," she said. They stayed until the canal light changed and the owner's family had begun to move around the kitchen with the sounds of a closing evening, and neither of them was in a hurry. And that was new for both of them in the respective ways that new things are new, which is to say quietly and with the particular quality of attention that does not predecide what it is looking at. The restaurant would be called many things in the city's accounting of that year. An institution protected. An executive vindicated. Mendicated. A trial concluded, a career transformed. But in the version that persisted, in the version told by the people who had been present in the original room, it was the story of a table with a better view, a man who knew what he was looking at and moved without performance to make space for it, a woman who did not collapse and did not perform gratitude and simply sat down and opened the menu and began. That was the thing beneath the credential. That was the thing that outlasts. 7 words had been spoken to diminish her, and she had stood through them, and 6 words had answered them, and she had sat down, and from a seated position, with the amber light on the water and the room recalibrated around her, she had begun the only thing worth beginning. Not a rebuilt version of what she had given away, something new, built on the only foundation that does not eventually fail, the attention that asks how, the calm that does not need control. The table that was always there,